Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
We take from the thousands of business books out there and test the author's ideas by comparing them to real-world challenges. With over 40 years of projects between us, we've got quite a bit to compare against. We give you the condensed takeaways, followed by our review with the authors.
We know you want actions, not theories, and it's actions that we want to help shape, because that's what the Wicked Podcast is all about, helping you to become a wicked company.
Hey, Marcus!
I just knocked
You almost
the
spit
microphone
out your whiskey. Don't do
with
that.
my whiskey.
It's too expensive. I'll try again.
No, we keep that in. It's like, we just had the lovely Gemma here who's from Scotland, so I thought I'd bring the scotch out.
That's really, really kind of you. That's really, really good. It is cold and wet in Portugal. What's going on in London?
It's grey. Oh my God, it's grey. It feels like, don't want to sound like a print designer, but it's like 20% extra black on the sky. It's just really dark, really dark.
Right.
I have to switch on the lights really early.
Okay, so I'm not planning to come back anytime soon. But in the meantime, Marcus, who's on the show?
So we have the lovely Gemma Milne on today, and she wrote a book called Smoke and Mirrors about hype and how to see through it, essentially.
And it was indeed a book about hype, but as we discussed during the interview, there's so much really, really good insight and information into a really wide range of topics, from farming to nuclear fusion. I mean, it's so much more than just a book on hype.
Absolutely, and I think what I liked, and I think that was interesting when we put the questions together, is actually not about the tech. It's actually about the critical thinking behind it. And there's a need in our culture and in most societies around the planet that we are brave enough to ask questions more and see that things are not black and white.
So my big takeaways, I mean, we only got there at the very end, but I love the fact that she said it was one of the most popular questions, the most frequent questions she got, which was, how do you do responsible hype? And I think it's understanding that organizations just need hype. They need attention, whether it's fundraising or whether it's to drive sales or whatever, they need to do that. And there's a certain amount of ethics involved in choosing how and when you use and build on that hype. So that was really good. And the second thing is, I mean, Gemma is incredibly smart. I mean, heaven knows how many individual PhDs that she has in order to get where she is. But she says, you know what, you can't be an expert on one thing and be expected to be an expert on everything. And if you are a company, you're trying to get a diversity of opinions, you need a diversity team, which we've talked about several times on the show, but you need multiple external opinions and get diverse opinions. Don't just take a single source to make a major decision. So if I'm going to advise my clients, I'm going to say, always get a diversity of views and do it from diverse teams. And if you're going to use hype, apply some ethics to your decision about how you're phrasing your hype. But that's my takeaways. What are yours?
Yeah, so on my side, I think the actions for organizations, and I've seen this a lot, and I think the tendency to think that certain things are right or wrong, and when we talk about getting in a specialist and listening to that person that we perceive as knowing more, and I've been around so many technologies that's only been around for, let's say, 5 years, or things that have been around less. And then you have specialists coming in, often claiming they've done this for 10, 15 years. And you go, yeah, that hasn't been even around there. Like, I work in service design. I think the name was maybe shaped, let's say, 15, 18 years ago or something like that. Before that, it didn't really exist. It had other things. But people out there with 25 years experience in service design, and you go, that's something you need to punch through, right? You need to bring those things in and say, well, ask questions, see how much it holds up. But at the same time, you can ask a lot of small questions. It doesn't have to be completely right, completely wrong, but go and ask more questions. And also be brave enough that you think you'll have your own opinion on it, that you maybe read a paper somewhere or you got some enough evidence of it and go, but this exists. So what does that mean, right? And that's where I think you, me, and I think Gemma mentioned it as well, where we often ask ourselves, why do organizations not spend more time on exploring these things? And asking questions and trying things before they go and build stuff. And I don't know why that is either. There's probably multiple answers to this, but I would say do it. Just spend a bit more time exploring, because these things are now so, those wicked problems, those moving targets, they're systems. They have network and exponential impact. On a very small nudge, you can have big things happening that can go wrong. So do lots of rather small steps and spend time on it. Even Project Management 101 tells us that the later you want to change something, the more expensive it gets. So we've been knowing that for 50, 60 years. That's just a cost argument.
Speaking of late, we've been trying to get our interviews kind of on time, and we've been failing horribly. So shall we quit solving the world's problems, and shall we go to the interview?
Yes. So ask more questions. Take time for research. Here's in 3 words. Let's go to the interview. So hello, everyone. Today we're here with Gemma Milne. Hello, Gemma, and thank you for making time for us.
Hi, thanks for having me. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Yes, because we all have drinks. Yay. So let's start at the top while we're still sober. And please tell us a bit who you are and why you wrote the book.
Sure. So I suppose I have a bit, well, everyone nowadays seems to have a strange route they've taken to their job. But I suppose a very quick post history. I studied maths at uni, did a very small amount of time interned in investment banking, thinking that was really what I wanted to do. Was there for 3 months and was like, nope, this is absolutely not what I want to do. So I Googled creative business jobs London. And of course, when you Google that, you end up in advertising. So I went and worked at Ogilvy for, originally on sort of, client management stuff, and then really didn't like that. And it ended up in the innovation team. So I was in corporate innovation, and my job was essentially to go find interesting startups and people and connect them to the agency. So I spent a lot of time just traveling and going to conferences and meeting awesome people. It was a really cool job. And it was kind of there that I started thinking about hype and its various different roles and the various different feelings I had towards it, shall we say. So obviously working in an advertising company, people who literally make hype, that is the job. But then also working in corporate innovation, which is an interesting kind of department, which is sometimes used as a form of hype and marketing for agencies. But equally, you're also trying to work out sort hype from reality in terms of what's new and what's interesting and what should people be paying attention to. And of course, I guess also thinking about is what we're doing and is what these innovations and whatnot, what they're doing, right or wrong, and all those sorts of questions kind of keep him in that job. And then that was kind of cut short after a couple of years. Ogilvy did a very innovative thing, and they shut the innovation team, so I was made redundant. And after that, I suppose I kind of fell into freelancing, doing various different kind of things, from journalism to a little bit of consulting here and there, mainly in the sort of innovation tech space, for companies, for European government and UK government, and ended up writing my book. And again, having that sort of working in journalism, thinking a lot about hype, thinking about the fact that I guess I was part of that as well, being a member of the media, but then also getting lots of pitches in my inbox and going to conferences and watching startups tell me how they're going to change the world, added to my kind of thinking around it. And I suppose the book was originally written out of a sense of frustration, being sort of a lover of science and tech, and it being the thing that I always wanted to do, and seeing on one hand people misunderstand it and perhaps not think that it's as interesting as it is, and me being like, God, I want everyone to find this amazing, but also on the same side, on the other hand, seeing companies and individuals say things about science and tech that are completely, in some ways, not true, massively over exaggerated, and sending people down the wrong garden path also was extremely frustrating. So I wanted to, I suppose, do a bit of hype busting. But when I looked into it a lot more, as you'll know from reading it, the topic kind of goes a little bit deeper than just going what's hype and what's not, and rather looks at the sort of phenomenon that is hype, and looks at it more as a tool, and kind of how can we wrestle with this, I guess, necessity that we have based on this kind of information world that we live in, whilst also making sure that we understand the world as best as possible. And to kind of round off the story, I suppose I'm now doing a PhD that's in looking at corporate futurism and sort of the ethics of that. So what does it mean to talk about narratives of the future in a corporate context, which obviously, builds on some of the themes that I got into with Smoke and Mirrors.
Wow. Yeah, I think I've stopped probably counting the kind of people who had a brush with advertising and marketing industry on that level. That's for sure. And I'm sure I've ended up at least in one type of self-help group getting through that.
Yeah.
But it's really as my personal, as I like to say, Steckenpferd, the whole wicked problem thing. I mean, your book is full of those, and it's really interesting to look at that. And I think someone looking at the complexities of what it is. So, and what I've come across a lot is when you go somewhere and you say, well, yeah, that is, let's say, AI, or, Troy is dealing a lot with blockchain, for example. It's like, oh, well, it's a bit more complicated than that. Or rather to say, what's the straightforward answer if that's working or not, or how much of this is a value? And you go, well, it's complicated. Those can be quite intimidating stories because, we know how businesses and organizations are set up. They don't always seem to have the time to really engage and look at and dig deeper into what does it mean for us and what is it actually. So how do you normally respond to people then that come to you and say, like, oh, isn't that just too complicated? Or if you have to say, instead of saying, well, it's complicated, what do you normally respond to?
Gosh, I mean, so many different things to say on this topic. I think the idea of sort of trying to search for a simple answer is the same sort of idea as trying to get the easy way out. It's not having to think and not having to wrestle with sometimes quite personal moral judgments that we don't necessarily want to think about or feel able to think about. And that's not me saying people that are looking for easy answers are bad people. It's not that at all. It's sometimes we don't have time or the inclination, or sometimes we're not getting paid to do that. It's not our jobs. All these various reasons for not feeling confident a lot of the time is the main one. But for me, it's trying to shift the conversation away from, oh, this is too difficult, just give me it straight, to going, if I give you it straight and you don't think about it, you'll probably cause some damage, or to, your company, or to other people, or to society as a whole, or whatever. So why would you want an easy answer quickly? So, and also, I think on the other hand, the idea of complexity is, I think sometimes complexity's got a bad rap. Like, it's this thing that we don't want. We want to try and sift through it. We want to try and unpick the complexity, when realistically, I think a lot of the time the most interesting things in life, whether it's in business or personal, whatever, comes from diving into complexity and trying to find your way around it. I mean, most literature is fiction is all about complex situations and seeing how people react, and you kind of going into that and going, what would I do and how would it work, and oh, that's difficult, and that's the richness of life, right? So I think it kind of comes back as well to the fact that we've not really been taught to be confident, or, we've been taught to try and find answers and not sit in this gray area. Even if you think about the way we talk about politics, it's like, what side are you on? This idea of sitting on the fence is like a cowardly position. It's like, well, no, I mean, actually, that's probably the most realistic position most of the time. That's not to say you excuse people from having an opinion, but it's rather, if you're completely one side or the other, I would argue you're probably not actually thinking that deeply. So what I say is, I suppose, to get past that, the bad rap thing, is to then go, okay, what does it look like to dive into something complex? And the kind of analogy that I use in the book is around, I suppose, like this idea of like a tidal wave of information that's coming towards you, which it can sometimes feel like, particularly if you said to someone, oh, go and work out what the deal is with like nuclear fusion. I mean, it's like, where do you start, especially if you've never come across it before? So it is this tidal wave of information. And people that are not wanting to deal with that complexity, that don't want to critically think, that don't feel able, kind of freeze and either run away or decide, this is not for me, takes off their wetsuit and runs off. Whereas people who perhaps are more inclined to like it or to see the importance of diving into complexity, jump into the little rubber dinghy, they have an oar that's probably going to snap, but they see it more as like a extreme sport, as opposed to this like dangerous situation that's really scary. And I think the key point here is that, people like myself that are in this space that thinks a lot about science and tech and have done for a long time, I still feel like that with most of these topics all the time, because they're not simple and because things are changing. But if I was to just go, oh, AI is bad and I'm never going to engage in anything to do with AI, I mean, where would that leave me? And I think it's about working out to what extent, and how important is it to you that you dive in. I think though, if you're feeling that fear and it's scaring you a lot, then it's probably it's probably worth going in and trying. It'll feel less scary once you at least are able to map what's going on, as opposed to just going to an expert. What does an expert even mean? But going to an expert and saying, can you just tell me straight? Because you'll probably miss something, and that, down the line could be even worse than the amount of time it would take to just swim around a little bit, and try and, see a couple of different viewpoints and at least map the complexity, map what's difficult, what are the different and it won't just be 2 sides, there's probably 8 sides. What are they? And a lot of time you can work it out yourself. You don't necessarily need to go do a PhD to be able to swim in amongst all that complexity.
Yeah, really, really nice analogy. I like the tidal wave of information, and it brings together a number of thoughts that were kind of going through my head while you were speaking. One, I try not to talk about facts or truth or lies. I talk about data, and I said that all data needs context and source, and that's part of what critical thinking is for me. Is the data is the sky is black. Well, if it's nighttime, you're right. The sky is black. It's not blue like normally people think it is. Or if you're a non-sighted person, then the sky is black, and you need source and context to look at all of this. But what I know and have figured out over the years is that critical thinking takes work. It's really hard work. It's worth doing. But if I really applied critical thinking to every single bit of data that came into my life, I would be overwhelmed and I would get nothing done.
Right.
And so a lot of people, what I call, outsource their critical thinking. They pick a pundit, they pick a point of view, whatever, and they say, okay, you're going to do my critical thinking for me, and I will decide my opinion based on what you think. And with social media being what it is, the polarization that's happening is really, really extreme. And so I'm going to kind of wrap this question up in 2 parts. One, the old quote attributed to many different people, one of which is to Mark Twain. I didn't have much time, so I wrote you a very long letter. And taking incredibly complex things and simplifying them down to their essence to where you can communicate them is indeed an art. And the other side of the art of engaging communities is around engaging them at an emotional level. Because a lot of the things, whether it's Brexit or whether it's the presidential election, people have been swallowing emotions whole and ignoring the data and the rational thought and the critical thinking that kind of goes along with it. So our audience are enterprises. They want to know what is the actionable insight? What can they do to better engage teams, to better engage shareholders or stakeholders, and better engage customers in this world of tidal information where people are outsourcing critical thinking and are easily hooked by emotion?
Sure. No, absolutely. Gosh, so much to say. I think the idea of outsourcing, we all have to do that to some degree, right? And there are people employed to do that for us. I mean, politicians are there to represent many. Scientists are in a job to try and find answers that we are meant to trust, as much as we can. And so there's a balance here between encouraging everybody to I guess, have a level of healthy skepticism about things that they read, whilst also not reducing trust in general around perceived expertise or around what society deems expert, whether it is scientists or politicians or so on and so forth. And I think when it comes to this idea of outsourcing, I mean, the first one is don't just have one person you outsource it to. I think that already could massively enhance how you think about things. And also not just one, what I mean by one person, not just one angle, shall we say. Try and find 3 angles about something that is obviously contested. Like for instance, if you're trying to work out whether you should, as a company, employ facial recognition technology for security purposes, right? That is something that is not 100% yes or 100% no. So you can find even just 3 or 4 different angles on this to try and work out, okay, what are the risks here? What are the benefits? And where does it sit with what we're trying to achieve as a company, who it is we're interacting with, and why we're doing it in the first place, right? How do I weigh all that up? That doesn't take that much time. That's not that difficult to do. And I think where this, especially when you're making decisions like this, I kind of refuse to believe that any company would take sort of, a big decision like an investment and say, oh, I'm just going to listen to one thing. I'm not going to try and map the different ideas here. I think what's key is just making sure that you have a diversity of different outsourced experts. If you don't have the expertise or the time or the in-house, people to do tons and tons and tons of research yourself, which they would probably end up looking at that whole field and reducing it down to a few things, more or less roughly the same as you would if you were good at making sure that you have those diverse inputs.
And on diversity, if I can interrupt, that's one of the big themes that we've had across a number of authors and a number of books. The broader and more diverse the teams that are involved in those decision processes, the more likely to have a better quality outcome.
Absolutely. I mean, to me, I don't know whether it's just because I've been engaging in these, or I've seen and heard these kind of narratives for a while now, but to me, it's so blatantly obvious the benefit of doing this now. So when I see teams that aren't diverse, it's kind of like, wow, it feels really, really, really out of date, and arguably quite dangerous. So I think, to me, that seems quite obvious, but I don't think we're always good with that in terms of looking for expertise elsewhere, in terms of whether it's different people in the media or whether it's different kind of bringing in different kind of experts. It's kind of like, let's just find who I think the best person is, or the person that's got the most, coverage around them that brings them up first when you Google, as opposed to being quite intentional about who you're bringing in and who you're reading and who you're taking those ideas from. It's just as important as who you have physically on your team. So I think that's one thing, that's kind of just making sure that you do weigh up pros and cons. You don't have to go and do a PhD in something in order to do that. You can do that in an afternoon, arguably. And I kind of refuse to believe that any big decision isn't worth the time looking at those kind of options. I think what you said earlier about this idea of like aligning with emotions is kind of interesting, because and what you said also about data and facts and truth is fascinating, because on one hand, I'm kind of looking at this as now a researcher in science and technology studies, and there's so much discussion around kind of, what is truth and situated knowledges and all this sort of things. So you have to be so almost like overly nothing is true to some degree, which I don't buy into that from a sort of practical perspective. But I like what you were saying about data and kind of context and sources, because the big word that I kind of always lean into and kind of harp on and on about is context. It's like, where did you get this message? Where did you get this idea from? And how was it put to you? Were you emotionally engaging with it, which is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But were you able to then see past that emotion? So like, a perfect example is phrases or ideas like the robots are going to steal our jobs. That's an extremely emotional idea. stealing, robots, this other, this thing that isn't human, this whatever, and of course jobs like security and all these sort of things. And also it's got a lot of connotations with how we talk about immigrants in the media, this idea of stealing jobs. So it's like a very emotionally weighted narrative. But the sort of, I suppose, data or the fact or the truth that you're kind of alluding to is around the reality of automation and what automation is, which ultimately is a replacement for basic human labor. So it's about how do you get to the sort of central point or the idea more so than the narrative that was used to get you there, and how do you kind of jump beyond the emotion. So for instance, you could easily talk about emotion by saying about automation by saying, corporate executives are making active decisions to replace human labor with robots that they have bought for the purpose of profit. It's another emotionally charged narrative that's getting to the same point. And so for me, a big thing that I'm trying to do with Smoke and Mirrors and just talking in general is, how do you try and get citizens and individuals and everybody to understand that hype, narratives, whatever, are normally used to capture attention, and they use emotional tools, but we have to ourselves be able to have the responsibility to and the curiosity and whatnot to go, that's interesting that I've been emotionally charged by that. Why am I scared? Isn't that interesting that I'm scared? What does that mean? Let's look into that. As opposed to going, I'm scared, that must mean this really scary thing is true in its scariness, and I'm only going to think about that. And that's kind of how I when I'm talking about like hype is this thing that exists and we just have to be aware of it. It's not about banishing it, it's about seeing that it's there, and getting people to reframe. If everybody said data, source, context the same as you, the world would be a better place, because it's about acknowledging the fact that there's a layer in between yourself and information, truth, data, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would you say that because there's quite a lot in there, and I'm trying to unpack, and while you're talking, there's a lot of references flying past my
Sorry, I tend to
brain.
ramble. Just interrupts me.
I'll do the same. It's great to observe it from my point of view to see how I sound. No, it's great because I think it just gives you this kind of multi-layered view on things. And so there's a couple of things. Apart from the fact, I think there's now been studies for a while where it shows, for example, that cross-disciplinary teams de-risk and perform better. The Google Aristotle study about best performing teams has shown as well that the soft skills, like letting someone speak and letting everyone speak who sits on the table, creates the best teams, creates the best results, right? So it's just starting to be really, really solid statistics on this, and from no one less than Google, for example. The other part's also, and I've just been watching and sending a friend of mine, I think I put it out on LinkedIn as well, is like, so Adam Savage, who used to do Mythbusters, he's this really probably some kind of polymath on, he can build you anything. He knows a lot of things about so many things. And he was asked if he is ever struggling to be a generalist like that, which is an odd question. I've been posed that question as well about, jack of all trades, and he likes to say, jack of all trades, master of none, often better than master of one, which is a really lovely notion, which goes into this idea of, if you have a specialist and only looks at things in a particular kind of way, you're gonna lose a lot of context, right?
Well, I mean, I say I'm jack of all trades, master of not getting stuck in a box. That's kind of how I talk
so
about
you're outside
it.
the box. Yeah, exactly. So it's that kind of thing. So, but all of that leads me then to, so it's either, these T-shaped, or which we've never probably met those kind of people, or whatever, polymath, like, and shifting a bit away from the special, because the specialist thing seems to have run its time a little bit. Not that specialists are not needed anymore, but at a particular time and phase maybe of problem solving, you need a different kind of skill. And then you can drill into it. I'm getting very excited here. But essentially, that gets me all the way back to the principle of a potential shift between not being able to say, or not needing to say right or wrong anymore, right? The world's not black and white. It's somewhere in between. It changes every day. But we're sitting in a society where politics are very polarized. Social media is very polarized. Where literally you always pin these, this is right, therefore this is wrong things against each other. What's your view on that kind of way of communicating, that kind of tendency that there is a right or wrong? Because we all know, and most scientists who are specialists would subscribe to the fact, well, it never stops. We only have more questions after that. So what do you think we could do or about to really break that habit?
So a few things to hear. So I don't think there's no such thing as right or wrong. I know you're not saying that there's no such thing at all, but I think that this is not about getting into such a gray area that you never do anything, right? I mean, and you hear so many examples of this, like, I don't know, you're standing in the supermarket aisle and you can't decide which yogurt to buy because, oh, this one's made in this country and they treated people badly, but then this one's bad for the planet, but then this one, and there's, you hear this with oat milk or almond milk or cashew milk or whatever. So actually sometimes you can argue that cow milk is better, so it's not about getting into a funk that there's simply no answer and therefore no action is taken, because A, we couldn't live our lives like that, and B, that also is a form of disassociation from responsibility, which at the end of the day, people, companies, governments, whatever, do have to take responsibility and have to do things and have to justify. I think it's about the journey of going from not just thinking, I think this is right, so we're going to do it, but going, I think this is right, why do I think this is right? And going on a bit of a journey to see if you really do think it's right, and being as open-minded as you possibly can. And, you might come out at the end going, yep, I do think it's right. I'm not saying that this original version of me was right all along, but I just happen to be right, and I've now got justification for it based on X, Y, and Z. Or I might come out and say, actually, no, I think it's wrong and I'm not going to take this action. Or I might say, actually, do you know what? I'm going to now go and consult more people because I still don't know. So I think it's more about encouraging the journey, not just of justification, but like of exploration. And that's kind of ties back to your point about the sort of jack of all trades, master of none. I mean, particularly in the sciences, if you think about the sort of people who tend to end up as a lab scientist, right? They tend to have been at school, studied the sciences at school as their main subjects, gone to university and studied the central science at the end of it's biology or physics or whatever, done a master's, done a PhD, become a research scientist. Like that's a very standard journey. That's not to say everybody's like that. But being someone who studied maths at university, I know for a fact that you don't learn any history, any philosophy, any ethics, anything at all as part of that degree at any stage of that journey that I was on. Yeah, okay, I could have taken electives, whatever, but it's not embedded at any point. And so I think from my own experience of like, and especially when I think about finishing university and going into banking, it was because, well, that was what you did as a maths student. It was either you became a maths teacher, you went into banking, or the Secret Service got in touch, which so the point I'm making is a lot of people are very siloed in jobs that require or we attribute expertise to. That's not to say that those people are not experts in that thing, but it doesn't mean that we should attribute expertise across other areas or assume that this individual, because they're a quantum physicist, they're also going to know about other things, because that's not necessarily the case, unless they are more of a kind of generalist or more of a polymath in other areas too. So I don't know. I mean, there's so much to say about whether we talk so much about how more people need to understand STEM. We need to get more people into STEM. More people should understand science. I think that people in science absolutely need to be reading history and politics and the arts. And I say that as someone who's gone on that journey myself and felt very late to it. And like, oh my God, I can't believe I've never really understood this really basic thing to everybody that does any form of humanities, because I just didn't happen to pick up a book on it to, my mid-20s. So, I think we have to consider, we have to be more open to that idea that, just because you're an expert in one thing doesn't necessarily mean that you can have something to say that is weighted in justification if that's not where your background lies. So hopefully that kind of answers the question somehow.
I mean, it's a very full kind of a full-bodied answer across the entire subject. I think it's really, really good that just because you're expert in one thing doesn't mean by proxy you're expert in everything. And I love the diversity of education. The scientists should read history and expand that. Your book is called Smoke and Mirrors. In your opening section, you talk about magicians. And I think it's a brilliant kind of pulling together for my next question, which is all about drawing attention. And a magician draws attention away from where it should be, so they can perform the trick. And some people in the audience focus their attention to find where is the sleight of hand. And I believe that hype is all about monetizing attention. Facebook monetizes attention. They don't sell your data, they sell your attention. Newspapers are selling attention. And even startups are trying to monetize attention, the attention of the VC community, because they're desperate to get all of that attention. And what I'm trying to figure out is, how do people draw attention responsibly?
Yeah, this is a question I get a lot. What does responsible hype look like, or whatever? Yeah, I mean, the reality is that we live in a world where it's difficult to get attention, but you need it if you want to be able to do certain things. And you know, you can't. I believe you can do it responsibly. So when I'm talking to startups, my sort of bits of advice that I give are around not telling problem solution stories, and instead telling system stories. So what I mean by that is, instead of sort of building this beautiful narrative, this personal story, we've all seen it in the startup pitches, the 5-minute pitches or whatever, where it's, you know, Jenny has a problem, her life looks terrible. You know, this has been a challenge for X many years. She's tried this and she's tried that, but none of it worked. We have created this. Jenny is now happy. Please give us your money. And it makes sense to tell that story, right? Because, I mean, God, yeah, that's what your product's trying to do, solve a problem. But it's, in my mind, it's completely irresponsible to not talk about the system in which your problem exists, in which your person exists, in which your solution exists, and particularly in the area that I'm most interested in, which is in deep tech, because most of the work in deep tech is, you know, working within ginormous global systems like the energy system or the agriculture system or travel or logistics or whatever. And so by saying, you know, we've created this, I don't know, solar panel for farmers so that they can, I don't even know, get more energy to, you know, so they can have sensors to feed their plants or something, right? I don't think that it's enough to talk about that. You'd have to talk about, well, what kind of farmers are you talking about? Big farms, small farms, like what do the sensors do? What happens with the data? Like, do they even have somewhere for the solar panel? Like, what, you know, the agriculture is very, as we know, very, very interconnected in so many different ways. And so distilling down to this like very simple sort of, here's a problem, here's a solution, I think is a very irresponsible way to talk about a product. And so it's, how do you talk about the system in which you exist and what part you fit into and how what you do impacts this global system, as opposed to like a very specific individual. And the other sort of area that I talk about with responsible hype is really making clear the difference between vision and reality, because a lot of the stuff when we talk about missions and you know, hyping up this, like, what is it you're trying to do as a startup, and particularly our company, because you want to kind of engender trust in those that are investing in you, that you're really in it, you know, for the long haul. You want, you know, the people who are buying into you, whether it's customers, whatever, to believe that you're doing it for a good reason or whatever. But sometimes what can get lost in translation is what you're ultimately aiming towards versus what you're currently doing. So an example would be a startup that's talking about, a company that's talking about connecting everybody to the internet using a particular kind of satellite technology that they've come up with, right? And the vision is like, everybody should have access to the internet. This is, we live in an age where it's, everyone needs to bank and live. And you can create this wonderful picture around what the world would be like if we all had internet. And that's wonderful. And you can say, I want to back, they can get, social tech funding, they can get tech for good, with the impact investors, all this sort of thing. But the reality is, in order to get your tech to like a cheap enough state, perhaps you need to sell your satellite technology to oil companies that are able to situate their shipping routes, or it's probably most likely to the military. And that's up to whether people want to engage with you, whether they think that's justifiable if the ends, justify the means. But if you don't put that forward, that's when it's irresponsible, right? It's about letting people make that decision for themselves, as opposed to you pushing this kind of idea that's emotional, that is tricking, has a tricking nature to it. There's a big difference between saying, this is what we want to get to, it's really hard, we need to do this in the meantime, but stick with us, this is where we're going and nobody else is doing it. That to me is far more compelling than saying we're connecting everyone to the internet, and then you go, why are they still not connected? Oh, well, we haven't put the satellite up yet. It's not going to be up for 8 years because we need to make money from military first. So I think it's not just about honesty. It's going back to that context thing. It's not about going, oh yeah, sorry, we are actually selling to the military. It's going, the reason we're doing it is because of this. And standing by it and going, we're making this decision because we think it's the right thing to do. If you don't think it's the right thing to do, maybe you need to be thinking about that a bit deeper, as opposed to thinking about what hype you're putting out. But if you think what you're doing as a business is justifiable, then put it out there. If you're hiding it, right. I don't know what to say to you.
So Gemma, like all, yeah, unfortunately we are out of time. I want to tell you that we really, really enjoy reading the book. And it's more than just a book about hype and how hype can be managed and responsible hype. You have got pages and pages of really great insights into cancer, into farming, into nuclear fusion. I mean, it's a great educational book above and beyond the hype. So really, really well done. Congrats to you. We both really enjoyed reading it. We've loved the time with you this evening. Marcus, any closing thoughts before we wish Gemma good night?
Yes. So it's really a book that is, I didn't count them, how many stories, but they're all wicked problems, which I love. I think it's great that someone breaks these things down and says, look, this is all these things that are happening. These are all these things that are actually connected. And I think it's a very timely book, in the age where, coronavirus and climate change, which are all wicked problems, we need to start shifting our mindset more towards being brave enough to dive into these, even so we're not scientists, because I think everyone has to contribute and collaborate on this. And I think the honesty there to say, well, reality will be different and reality will show, and you need to wait for that and you need to try and experiment those things, is really, 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 really important. And so, so therefore it's a very timely book. It's sort of, now after at least one night's sleep after I read it, it's actually great for any of the subject matters and stories you go into. Like, you can look it back up, you go, hang on a second, fusion, let me just read that. And there's so much in about fusion or AI and those things, and it's really, really brilliant. So for that, it's a great book like that. And I really, really love it for it. So thank you so much, Gemma, for, please.
No, I was going to say, if I could just say one little thing. First of all, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. One, just for listeners who haven't read it and don't have the context, my goal with all these chapters is, yes, to obviously educate people on these various different things. But what I actually really want is to kind of give people the little nodes of understanding enough so that you can fill in the gaps yourself. You can think about these things yourself. And crucially, you can then follow the news on these things. You can see an announcement about nuclear fusion and think, that's interesting because of this and that. And, I wonder what that means, and it allows you to kind of follow the current conversations, as opposed to feeling like you're getting like a science explanation of something that happened 50 years ago. It's more about trying to be current. And, the only way to beat hype, the only way to get past this whole attention thing that does result in polarization and problematic emotions and all sorts, is for people to feel empowered to engage, as opposed to shying away and kind of just seeing things at face value. It's like we can't stop the information train. So all we can do is empower ourselves. And this is just my little contribution to that.
That's brilliant. I think it's also, I think is it James Burke many like a few decades ago who did the Constellations TV show and those kind of things, showing the world is more interconnected, those kind of things. It feels like that, and I think it's something media could borrow from and bring back to go.
I hope so.
That'd be great. Okay, thank you, Gemma. Thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Thank you for having me. This was good fun.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.